What if the person you've been chatting with online knows far more about you than you ever shared? When a simple message turns into a terrifying ordeal, the question isn't just how they found you, it's what they'll do next. Several years ago, when I was about 15 years old, I spent a lot of time online and used an application called Discord to chat with people. Shortly after I started using the app, I met a guy named Esteban through a video game forum, and we quickly began chatting regularly. One day, Esteban asked me what I looked like. Without much thought, I sent him a picture of myself. He complimented me, saying I was beautiful, that he loved my long dark hair, and admired how I did my eye makeup. Flattered and excited, I thanked him. Within a week, he told me he loved me, and I admitted I felt the same. I know it sounds fast, but I was only 15, and everything felt so intense and real at that age. Esteban and I seemed to have a lot in common. He was handsome and had a unique style, always wearing black, just like me. But as time went on, our virtual relationship started to feel overwhelming. He constantly wanted to know where I was and where I lived. I only told him I was in Texas, but refused to share specifics. He claimed he also lived in Texas and began pushing for us to meet in person. Though he was persistent, I wasn't ready. His texts became incessant, and I felt suffocated. I started avoiding him, gradually limiting our interactions. Despite my withdrawal, Esteban didn't let up. He continued messaging me as if nothing had changed. Then came the night my parents went on a trip to celebrate their 20th wedding anniversary, leaving me home alone for the first time. At first, I enjoyed the solitude. As night fell, I made sure all the windows and doors were locked and settled on the couch to watch TV. The quiet house felt strange and a bit unsettling, but I tried to ignore my nerves. About 20 minutes later, I heard a knock on the window behind me. My heart raced as I realized I had forgotten to close the curtains. Assuming it was a prank by the neighborhood kids, I cautiously approached the window. To my relief, no one was there. I closed the blinds, hoping that would be the end of it. As I returned to the couch, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Esteban. "I see you now." Chills ran down my spine. I responded, telling him not to joke about such things since I was home alone. He replied that he wasn't kidding, that he was outside my house. He even knew my parents were out of town. My stomach dropped. I demanded to know how he had found my address. He revealed he had tracked my location through Snapchat and had been watching me for 2 days. I was horrified. Not only had I never given him my address, but he had also been spying on me. A knock on the door made my blood run cold. Esteban's voice called out, asking me to let him in. Frozen with fear, I texted him, trying to stay calm. I reminded him that I wasn't ready to meet in person, and that what he was doing was wrong. But he didn't listen. Instead, he apologized for scaring me and insisted he had come all this way just to surprise me. He sounded unnervingly casual, as if everything he was doing was normal. Terrified but feeling I had no choice, I reluctantly opened the door. There he was, tall and handsome, just like in his pictures. But something about him felt off. His intense gaze sent shivers down my spine. Esteban smiled and stepped inside, ignoring my polite request for him to leave. He made himself comfortable on my couch, flashing a smirk as he joked about my lack of hospitality. I firmly reminded him that he wasn't invited, but he brushed me off. When he walked into my kitchen without permission, I followed, warning him that I would call the police. That's when everything took a horrifying turn. He grabbed a knife from the counter and turned to me, his expression dark with anger. My heart pounded as he advanced, saying he wouldn't leave without getting what he came for. I raised my hands and begged him to put the knife down. His sinister smile only widened as he taunted me. Summoning every ounce of courage, I bolted for the door. He chased me, knife in hand, but I managed to unlock it and run into the street, screaming for help. My neighbor, a police officer, heard my cries and rushed over with his gun drawn. Esteban panicked and tried to flee, but the officer fired warning shots into the air, forcing him to stop. He was arrested and later sentenced to several years in prison for stalking and attempted murder. This experience scarred me deeply. Even now, years later, I have nightmares about that night. It's terrifying to think how close I came to being another victim of someone I thought I knew. What if the online stranger you thought you knew turned out to be lurking just outside your home, knowing your every move? This chilling encounter will leave you questioning every friend request you've ever accepted. Stay until the end to uncover the terrifying truth. Several years ago, when I was about 15 years old, I spent most of my time online, often using an application called Discord to chat with people. Shortly after I started using the app, I met a guy named Esteban on a video game forum, and we continued talking afterward. One day he asked me what I looked like, and without much thought, I sent him a picture of myself. He complimented me, saying I was beautiful, that he liked my long dark hair, and loved the way I did my eye makeup. I thanked him, feeling excited by the attention. About a week later, Esteban confessed he loved me, and as naive as it may sound, I told him I felt the same way. Keep in mind, I was just 15. Esteban and I had a lot in common, and he was a very handsome guy. Oddly enough, he always wore black, just like me. However, as time went on, our virtual relationship began to feel overwhelming. He constantly wanted to know where I lived. I told him I was in Texas but gave no further details. He then claimed he also lived in Texas and insisted on meeting me immediately, saying he wanted to make our relationship a reality. I wasn't sure about it and told him as much. We talked every day, but his clingy behavior became suffocating. He would text me constantly, and eventually I began avoiding him. I wasn't direct about wanting to stop talking altogether, but I started interacting less with him. Despite my reduced responses, Esteban's behavior remained intense. One day, my parents went on a trip to celebrate their 20th wedding anniversary, leaving me home alone for the first time. I initially didn't mind, but as night fell, I started to feel uneasy. I made sure all the windows were closed and the doors locked before sitting in the living room to watch TV. About 20 minutes later, I heard a knock on the window behind me. Realizing I had forgotten to close the curtains, I assumed it was just some neighborhood kids playing a prank. I walked to the window, my heart racing, but when I looked outside, there was no one there. Feeling a bit relieved, I closed the blinds and returned to the couch. Just then, I got a text from Esteban that read, "I see you now." I replied, telling him I was busy and couldn't chat, but he insisted, saying he knew I wasn't busy because he could see me. Panic began to set in. I told him not to joke like that because I was home alone, and it was already making me nervous. That's when he told me he wasn't kidding, that he was outside my house. He even knew my parents were out of town. My stomach sank. I demanded to know how he had found out where I lived. He admitted he had tracked my location through Snapchat and had been watching me for 2 days before deciding to come to my house. My fear turned to outright terror. I had never shared my address with him, and here he was, claiming to have been stalking me. Suddenly there was a knock at the front door, followed by a voice I recognized. It was Esteban. He was calling my name, asking me to open the door. I froze in fear. Alone and with no one to protect me, I texted him, pleading with him to leave, reminding him I had said I wasn't ready to meet in person. But he dismissed my concerns, saying he wouldn't leave after driving so far to see me. His tone wasn't aggressive, but his calmness made it all the more unsettling. When I eventually opened the door, I found myself face to face with Esteban. He was tall and handsome, just as he appeared in his pictures, but something about him felt off his intense gaze, the way he smiled. He stepped inside despite my protests, making himself comfortable on the couch. I tried to politely ask him to leave, but he ignored me. He even joked about how rude it was not to offer him something to drink or eat. When I threatened to call the police, Esteban's demeanor changed. He grabbed a knife from the kitchen and pointed it at me, his face twisting with anger. He told me he wouldn't leave without getting what he came for. Pure terror consumed me as I realized how dangerous the situation had become. I managed to make a run for the front door, screaming for help. Thankfully, my neighbor, who happened to be a policeman, heard my cries and intervened. He chased Esteban down the street, firing warning shots into the air. Esteban was eventually subdued and arrested. It turned out he was 18 years old, and he was later sentenced to several years in prison for harassment and attempted murder. This experience left lasting scars. Even now, I have nightmares about that night and the close encounter I had with a predator. It taught me the importance of being cautious online and to never underestimate the lengths someone might go to if they become obsessed. An ordinary evening walk turned into a night of sheer terror when I realized someone was watching me. And they weren't alone. What started as a routine stroll became a fight for survival you'll never forget. This happened when I was 16 years old, but it was so shocking that even with my bad memory, I remember it very clearly. Honestly, I think this memory will haunt me for the rest of my life. I often went for walks in the evenings, either alone or with my neighbor Lise. However, that night, my neighbor couldn't join me. We usually went out around 10 p.m., but I was impatient that night, so I went out about 10 minutes earlier. It was summertime in Phoenix, but I wore my black hoodie anyway. The reason? I was a pretty small girl, even for my age, and I always carried a knife up my sleeve in case of trouble. There was security in the area, but they were pretty much useless and didn't like kids anyway. Wearing black was a way to avoid catching the attention of patrolling cops, and also to stay hidden from anyone who might notice me. This was a lower-class suburb, and while crime had lessened over the years, it still happened occasionally. The area was heavily wooded, and the roads had no streetlights. However, I had lived there all my life, so the moonlight was usually enough for me to see where I was going. I walked to the local park and sat on the swing, just as I had done countless times before. The park was old and poorly maintained. The swing creaked every time I moved, the wooden picnic tables were half rotten, and the paint was peeling. The metal slide was covered in rust. The park was bordered by two roads, one in front of it and another running along its side, separated by a thin line of trees. I put on my headphones, as I always did, to listen to music while swinging and enjoying the tranquility. For me, this was like therapy. I couldn't explain why, but I loved it. After a while, my favorite song came on, and I started singing. I loved to sing and was pretty good at it, but I always had stage fright. The park at night was my safe place to sing freely without anyone hearing me. That night, however, was different. As I sang, my blood froze when I noticed a figure in the darkness about 50 to 100 feet ahead of me on the road. My initial fear was embarrassment. What if this random person had heard me singing? But then, an even deeper sense of unease crept in. Something felt wrong about this person. I realized it was a man, walking quickly, almost running. I assumed he might be fleeing from something or chasing someone, but as I looked around, I didn't see anyone else, just me. The man passed through the park, seemingly unaware of my presence. I waited for a few minutes to ensure he was gone, and when I felt it was safe, I resumed singing. After a couple more songs, I decided to head home. It was after 10:30 p.m., and I still hadn't done my walk. My mom was going to be mad since I wasn't supposed to be out so late. Despite trying to focus on my walk, I couldn't shake the bad feeling in my gut. It was the same sensation you get when you feel like you're being watched. At one point, I thought I saw something moving behind the tree line, but I dismissed it as an animal. Deer, dogs, and other creatures were common in the area. Still, the unease gnawed at me. I decided to cut my usual 30-minute walk down to just 15 minutes. I started heading home, walking along the main road. As I was leaving the park, I saw someone running along the side road toward the main road. It was the same man as before. He didn't look particularly creepy or homeless, but I couldn't ignore the bad feeling I had about him. I crossed to the opposite side of the road to avoid walking directly past him. When I reached the intersection ahead, I stopped and glanced at him. He seemed normal, of average height, wearing a pure white baseball cap with no logos and a plain white polo shirt. There wasn't a speck of dirt on him. The moonlight almost made him glow, like some kind of ghost. But as I passed him, I felt his gaze on me. I pretended not to notice, occasionally glancing around as though I was looking at the trees. In reality, I was trying to keep an eye on him out of my peripheral vision. Once I was about 15 feet past the intersection, I looked back again. My stomach dropped. He had turned around and was now following me. I tried to convince myself he might just be taking an extra long walk and wasn't actually following me. But then, a horrifying thought struck me. What if he had been watching me from the tree line earlier? What if he had been there the entire time? I gripped my knife tightly, ready to use it if necessary. Running wasn't an option. My ankle had been injured before, and I knew I couldn't outrun him. As I walked faster, I saw a pair of headlights shining on the road ahead. Relief flooded me when I realized it was Jem's dad's car. I recognized the shape of the headlights as he approached. I tried to wave him down subtly, not wanting to alert the man following me. Jem's dad slowed his car but didn't stop, likely thinking I was just saying hello. Still, it was enough. As Jem's dad passed, his headlights shone directly on the man. The stranger slowed his pace, backing off and crossing to the other side of the road. For about 5 or 6 seconds, I was out of his sight. I took that opportunity to round the corner and start running. I didn't stop until I got home, locking the door behind me. I texted Jem immediately, asking her to meet me outside. She agreed, and as soon as she came over, I ran to her house, not wanting to stay outside any longer. I explained everything to Jem, and just as I finished, her dad walked in. He looked worried and admitted he had been about to check on me. When I asked if he had seen the man following me, he confirmed it. He also told us something that sent chills down my spine. Up ahead, parked on the side of the road with its lights off, was a car. Its door was open, and another man was inside, waiting. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. They weren't just random strangers. They were working together, and their intention had almost certainly been to kidnap me. To this day, I don't know what they planned to do, and I hope I never find out. I'm just thankful I made it out of that situation unharmed. From that night forward, I never went to the park at night again, especially not alone. Working at a liquor store, Seemed like an ordinary job until the night a coworker's sinister secrets turned it into a fight for survival. You won't believe how this nightmare ends. I was working in a liquor store inside a gas station while I was in college. Since I had classes during the day, I logically opted for the night shift. It was a bit demanding, but youth helped. For a long time, there was only one person working at night. Many of my female colleagues had complained about the lack of security cameras and how, during those hours, all kinds of shady characters came in. In fact, one night before I started working there, a woman came in to buy groceries. When she went out to her car, a man assaulted her at gunpoint. She gave him the money, and luckily, the guy let her go. The woman returned to the store, crying hysterically. Although the police arrived right away, they never found the assailant. Personally, I preferred working with someone else. Even if there were no security issues, the night passed much faster when I had someone to talk to. The girl I usually closed with got along with me really well. In total, there were 4 of us doing the night shift: Oscar, Nico, Diana, and me. Diana had another job and only worked a couple of nights a week to lend a hand to one of the managers. Oscar and I worked together about 3 nights a week, and Nico would join one of us another 2 nights. Diana was super nice and a lot of fun, but she didn't like the work much. Oscar often got mad at her because she stayed at the cash register while he did all the restocking. However, since she only came 1 night a week, we didn't think much of it. Nico, on the other hand, was a different case altogether. He worked 5 nights a week, like Oscar and me, but he was never paired with more than 1 person at a time. Nobody seemed to like working with him. Nico was one of those people who spilled their entire life story the moment you met them, sharing details that made you uncomfortable. He often complained about his marriage problems. Apparently, he had struggled with alcohol and drugs. Although he claimed to have replaced hard drugs with weed, he clearly hadn't controlled his drinking. It was evident in his behavior. He was also a bit of a pain, but in this kind of job, you get used to all sorts of people. I had been on the job for about 5 months when Nico's story started to get more intense. Out of nowhere, he began telling people that he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was younger and needed to take medication to prevent violent outbursts. It wasn't exactly what you wanted to hear from someone you were working with alone in the middle of the night. Still, I tried to be understanding. Many people with mental illness face stigma, and I didn't want to add to that. I told Nico that lots of people rely on medication to manage their conditions, and as long as he stayed honest with his doctors and took his meds, there was no reason he couldn't live a normal life. He seemed satisfied with my response. For the next week, Nico was especially friendly toward me. He frequently reminded me that he was taking his medication and feeling much better. I responded politely, though Oscar could tell I wished Nico would stop talking to me about it. Oscar had a wife and 2 daughters, ages 12 and 8, and he often acted like a protective father figure. He would go out of his way to cut my conversations with Nico short, which I greatly appreciated. Oscar didn't hide the fact that he didn't like Nico, and honestly, he had good reason. Nico was getting closer and closer to me, which I didn't exactly want. For some reason, he felt too comfortable around me. Soon, he started sharing disturbing details about why he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. These stories often contained violent and graphic content, which made me extremely uncomfortable. I repeatedly told Nico I didn't want to hear about those things. He acted like he understood, but would bring it up again an hour later. When I told Diana about it, she said she would handle it and later spoke to a manager she was friends with. The manager said there wasn't much she could do, as it seemed I was the only person Nico spoke to in that way. However, after Diana's conversation, 2 other coworkers reported inappropriate comments Nico had made to them. When questioned, I confirmed that my coworker's complaints matched my own experiences. Nico received a final warning and was sent home. The next 2 times I saw Nico, he went on rants about how the people who reported him were just out to get him. I assumed he didn't know I had also been questioned, and neither Oscar nor I had any intention of telling him. Honestly, we were both scared of him, and not without reason. Nico was clearly unstable. At one point, he got so angry that he almost started crying. He said the people who reported him were lucky he was taking his medication because without it, they wouldn't even be alive. We didn't take the threat seriously at the time, but in hindsight, we should have. That night, Nico clocked out without further incident. Oscar and I continued our shift restocking items from the late delivery truck. At one point, Oscar went to refill the beverage coolers while I restocked shelves. Suddenly, the doorbell chimed, indicating someone had entered the store. "Good evening," I called out, heading toward the register. Normally, customers at that hour just bought cigarettes or paid for gas, so I wasn't too concerned. As I approached, I froze. It was Nico. He wasn't wearing his uniform, and his face was twisted in an unsettling grin. My stomach dropped when I noticed he was holding something in his hand, a knife. He walked toward the counter and then stopped, staring at me. In a sing-song tone, he said, "I'm going to cut you into tiny little pieces, so small they'll never find you." Fear surged through me as I realized the danger I was in. I screamed for Oscar, who came running from the back. Seeing Nico with the knife, Oscar didn't hesitate. He lunged at Nico, knocking him off balance. "Run," Oscar shouted. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted toward the back door, my heart pounding. But when I reached it, I discovered Nico had blocked it with a dumpster. We were trapped. I turned to see Nico recovering, his knife glinting under the fluorescent lights. Oscar grabbed a shelf pole and stood between us and Nico, shouting for him to leave. Just then, we heard sirens in the distance. Nico hesitated for a moment, then fled out the front door. The police arrived shortly after and arrested him a few blocks away. That night was the most terrifying experience of my life. Nico was charged with attempted murder and a host of other crimes. I never saw him again, but I still feel chills whenever I think about how close we came to tragedy that night. Working the night shift at a nursing home is unsettling enough, but when the residents begin acting possessed and the shadows outside reveal a dangerous intruder, it becomes a night you'll never forget. Stay tuned for the terrifying truth. I worked in a nursing home for over 5 years. I really loved working there. It was stressful at times, and I really hated changing bedpans, but for the most part, my job was fun. I had a great relationship with the elderly residents, especially the old ladies. They called me Rito because of my red hair, and most of them treated me like I was their grandson. You can imagine how much they spoiled me. Unfortunately, the center was understaffed. Not everyone enjoys this kind of work, and with budget issues, the salaries weren't the best either. For this reason, I had to work the night shift 3 days a week. I hated the night shift more than anything else. I would have rather cleaned 100 beds than spent all night in that place. This wasn't because of the elderly or the work itself, but because all the lights were turned off, except for a single lamp at the front desk. My job was to sit there all night, check the rooms hourly, and call an ambulance if there was a medical emergency. This might not seem so bad aside from the boredom, but you don't know how creepy the place was in the dark. I'm a brave guy, I can take care of myself, but in that nursing home after hours, I felt like a scared 6-year-old. The building was over 100 years old, so it was constantly creaking and settling. Since we were surrounded by a wooded area, I would often see the silhouettes of animals outside through the windows, slithering in the darkness. Despite my nerves, I never really had a problem during the night shift until one fall evening when I had been working there for 3 years. It was a Friday and I had been called in at the last minute because my coworker Edgard had been fired for stealing meds. At first, things were normal. All the residents had taken their medications and gone to bed. I was at the front desk, checking my phone, when suddenly I heard a door slam. Startled, I ran to see what was going on. That's when I saw Vilma, one of our residents, standing in the hallway, trembling. Her eyes were wide open, and she was staring at something unseen. I approached her slowly, afraid she might hurt herself. "Vilma, what's wrong?" I asked. She mumbled, "He's outside, he's behind us." If this had happened during the day, I would have assumed Vilma was having an episode related to senile dementia. But this was the night shift, and hearing those words made my heart pound in my chest. Her expression and tone were so chilling that I felt genuine fear. I tried to calm myself and told her, "Wait here." I slowly walked into her room and looked out the window. There was a clump of trees just outside. I searched for a few seconds and saw nothing. Suddenly I jumped back as I noticed a figure running into the shadows. It wasn't an animal, it looked like a person. I quickly closed the latch on the window and ran back into the hallway. "Okay, I think I saw it," I told Vilma. "Wait here, okay? I'm going to call the police." I started heading toward the front desk, but Vilma grabbed the back of my shirt and pulled me back. Vilma had never done anything like that before. She was a somewhat eccentric old lady, but she wasn't violent. "Vilma," I said, "let me get the phone." She looked straight at me, and I noticed something about her seemed different. Her gaze was strange, almost wild. With surprising strength, she grabbed my shoulders and spun me around. Before I could react, she laughed maniacally. At that moment, I didn't know what to think. Maybe she was indeed having a psychotic break, but this was the first time she had acted like this. I pushed her gently away and ran down the hallway to call the police. Before I reached the desk, more doors opened. Angelica, Luciana, and Linda stumbled out of their rooms. Like Vilma, they were trembling, wide-eyed, and mumbling incoherently. "Rojito," Angelica shouted, blocking my path. More doors opened. Residents began pouring out of their rooms. They were all dressed in pajamas, laughing, shouting, and acting erratically. The entire building filled with their unsettling voices. Linda grabbed my arm tightly, and Angelica stood in my way. "Where are you going?" Rojito, Angelica asked, smirking. Luciana, a large woman who had always been kind to me, suddenly hugged me tightly and started caressing my hair. "You know, my husband had red hair too," she said with a wink. I pushed her off and ran toward the desk. Finally, I reached it and grabbed my phone. With trembling fingers, I called 911. 911, what's your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. "Send as many people as you can," I said, my voice shaking. "What is the nature of the emergency?" I had no idea how to explain what was happening. None of it made sense. "There's been an attack," I finally said and hung up. The residents continued laughing, wandering, and mumbling to themselves. That's when I noticed the door to our medicine cabinet was wide open. Someone else was here. I approached the cabinet cautiously and heard someone rummaging through the shelves. "Hello? Who's in there?" I called out. The rummaging stopped. Slowly, a figure stepped into the light. "Edgard," I whispered. Edgard, the former coworker who had been fired, stood before me. He was disheveled, with dried leaves stuck to his clothes. It was clear he had been outside in the woods. "You took it all," he said angrily. "What are you talking about?" "My personal stash. You used it all." He held up an empty pill bottle. It dawned on me he had been mixing drugs into the residents' medications. Whatever he had added was causing their erratic behavior. At that moment, the residents' screams grew louder. I turned to see Martin, one of our elderly residents, convulsing on the floor. I rushed to Martin to keep him from hurting himself. "Edgard," I shouted, "what the hell did you put in those pills?" He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a syringe and injected Martin with something. Moments later, Martin stopped convulsing. "Vilma," someone screamed. Vilma collapsed, shaking violently. Then 2 more residents fell to the floor. Paramedics arrived just in time. They helped administer injections to counteract the drug's effects. Fortunately, there were no fatalities. Edgard was arrested and narrowly avoided manslaughter charges. This incident remains the most horrifying experience of my career. Though I continued working at the nursing home for another 2 years, I'll never forget that night. What would you do if a simple night shift at your cleaning job turned into a horrifying game of cat and mouse with a dangerous intruder? Stay with this chilling tale to uncover how one man escaped the clutches of terror in an empty office building. My name is Augusto, and I am currently a filmmaker, something I am truly passionate about and have worked very hard to achieve. However, before dedicating myself to my great passion, I held several odd jobs to pay the bills and make ends meet. One of those jobs was working for a cleaning company. In this role, I would go to various businesses in the city, mostly offices and malls, and clean them thoroughly to prepare them for the next day. The pay was decent, and the team I worked with was friendly. We were all good friends and colleagues, though we didn't always work together. Sometimes we were a team, and other times I worked alone. Our shifts rotated since the company operated around the clock. Many of our clients required night cleaning because their businesses were active during the day. While some might dread working nights, I didn't mind. Traffic was light, and I could work quietly without interruptions. Once my tasks were complete, I could leave without any hassle. One night I was assigned to clean an office building where I often worked. This wasn't a massive skyscraper, but a 3-story building. When I arrived, I was the only person there. The routine was simple. I had a to-do list: vacuuming, cleaning the bathrooms, and disinfecting specific areas. The entire job usually took about 2 hours. Like always, I was handed the keys upon arrival and found all the lights turned off. I started on the first floor, following my usual routine. Everything was quiet, as expected. Once I finished the first floor, I moved up to the second. I had been on the second floor for about 20 minutes, vacuuming, when I thought I heard the sound of the elevator. I paused, turned off the vacuum cleaner, and listened carefully. My ears didn't deceive me. The elevator was moving, heading to the 3rd floor. This puzzled me. I was certain no one else was supposed to be in the building. Why would the elevator be in use? I tried not to overthink it and continued cleaning, though I couldn't completely shake the unease. As I finished vacuuming and moved on to clean a window in one of the offices, I heard another noise from above. It sounded like something being moved on the 3rd floor. My heart raced as I tried to stay calm. I convinced myself it was nothing, but the creaking sounds kept me on edge. Eventually, curiosity overpowered my fear. I decided to investigate. I walked toward the staircase, listening for any signs of movement. At first, everything was silent. Then, out of nowhere, a man darted from behind a wall and ran into the stairwell. I only saw him for a brief moment, but that was enough to know he didn't belong there. He wasn't wearing office attire or anything that suggested he was an employee working late. Panic set in. I didn't know who he was or how he had gotten inside. For a split second, I wondered if he was simply a worker staying late, but his behavior hiding and running suggested otherwise. I cautiously approached the stairwell and opened the door. Silence greeted me. Peering inside, I found no one. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound authoritative. There was no response. I shouted again, warning that no one was supposed to be in the building and that I would call the police if they didn't leave immediately. Then, I heard a door slam on the second floor. Though the man didn't answer, the sound reassured me that he was leaving. I figured my warning had scared him off. I stayed in the stairwell for a couple more minutes to make sure he was gone. Once I felt it was safe, I returned to the second floor and resumed my work. I quickly finished cleaning and moved up to the third floor. By this point, everything seemed quiet again. I convinced myself the man had left and that there was no reason to worry. While working on the third floor, I was in a corridor when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and my blood ran cold. It was him. The man was charging toward me with a metal bar in his hand. Adrenaline surged through my body as I turned and sprinted down the hallway. I screamed for help, but deep down I knew it was unlikely anyone would hear me. The area was a business district, and at this hour it was deserted. I ran toward the stairwell, knowing I had no chance of reaching the elevator. If this man caught me, I had no doubt he would harm me. I reached the stairs and dashed down as quickly as I could. I could hear the man chasing me, his footsteps pounding against the steps. At one point, I glanced back and saw how close he was, too close for comfort. Though I only caught a brief look at his face, I could see his long, sticky hair and unkempt beard. His clothes were worn and torn, suggesting he might be homeless. I ran faster than I ever thought possible, fueled by sheer terror. When I reached the first floor and saw the front door, it felt like a beacon of hope. I bolted through it, not stopping until I reached my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I reversed out of the parking lot, I saw the man standing at the building's entrance, clutching the metal bar. A few seconds later, he threw it aside and disappeared into the darkness. I drove to a 24-hour store a few blocks away and called the police. When they arrived, I led them back to the building. They searched the premises but found no one. The man had vanished. That night, I informed my supervisors about the incident. They alerted the building's owners, who took steps to improve security. Fortunately, nothing like that ever happened again. The terrifying part of this experience was the realization of how close I had come to being harmed or worse. I continued working for the company for another year, but I never wanted to return to that building. This was, without a doubt, the most frightening experience of my life. To this day, I dread to think what would have happened if I hadn't realized the man was coming after me, or if he had caught up to me before I escaped. A peaceful night at a liquor store turned into a nightmare when an unhinged coworker returned with a chilling plan. Trapped inside with no escape, would we survive? Watch to the end to find out how this terrifying encounter unfolded. I was working in a liquor store inside a gas station while I was in college. Since I had classes during the day, I logically opted for the night shift. It was a bit demanding, but being young helped me manage. For a long time, only one person worked at night. Many of my female colleagues had complained about the lack of security cameras and how, during those hours, all kinds of questionable characters came into the store. In fact, one night before I started working there, a woman had come in to buy groceries. When she went back to her car, a man assaulted her at gunpoint. She gave him the money, and fortunately the guy let her go. The woman returned to the store crying hysterically. Although the police arrived quickly, they never found the assailant. Personally, I preferred working with someone else. Even if there weren't any security concerns, the night shift felt much shorter when there was someone to talk to. The girl I used to close with got along with me really well, so we often had an enjoyable time. There were 4 of us who did the night shifts: Oscar, Nico, Diana, and me. Diana had another job and only worked a couple of nights a week to help out one of the managers. Oscar and I worked together about 3 nights a week, while Nico joined one of us for the other 2 nights. Diana was super nice and fun to work with, but she didn't enjoy the job much. Oscar often got annoyed with her because she preferred staying at the cash register while he did all the restocking. However, since she only worked once a week, we didn't make a big deal out of it. Nico, on the other hand, was a different story. He worked 5 nights a week like Oscar and me, but nobody enjoyed working with him. He was the type of person who overshared his personal life as soon as he met you, often revealing details that made you uncomfortable. Nico frequently complained about his marriage. He said he had struggled with alcohol and drugs, but claimed to have replaced hard drugs with weed. However, it was obvious he hadn't controlled his drinking. His behavior made that clear. After I had been on the job for about 5 months, Nico's stories became more intense. He suddenly began telling people that he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was younger and needed medication to prevent violent outbursts. That wasn't something you wanted to hear from someone you were working with alone in the middle of the night. Still, I tried to be understanding. I told him that a lot of people rely on medication for various conditions and that as long as he stayed honest with his doctors and took his meds, there was no reason he couldn't live a normal life. He seemed pleased with my response. For the next week, Nico was especially friendly to me, frequently reminding me that he was taking his medication and feeling much better. I responded politely, but Oscar could tell I wished Nico would stop talking to me about it. Oscar, who had a wife and 2 daughters, was very protective. He often acted like a father figure and would go out of his way to end my conversations with Nico quickly, which I greatly appreciated. Oscar made no secret of his dislike for Nico, and honestly, he had good reason. Nico's behavior toward me became more intrusive. He started sharing disturbing details about why he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. These stories often contained graphic and violent content. I repeatedly told Nico I didn't want to hear about those things. He acted like he understood, but would bring them up again an hour later. When I told Diane about it, she said she would talk to the manager. After Diana's conversation, 2 other coworkers reported inappropriate comments Nico had made to them. When questioned, I confirmed that what they said matched my own experiences. Nico received a final warning and was sent home. The next 2 times I saw him, Nico went on rants about how the people who reported him were out to get him. I assumed he didn't know I had also been questioned, and neither Oscar nor I had any intention of telling him. One night, Nico became particularly upset. He said the people who reported him were lucky he was taking his medication because without it, they wouldn't even be alive. At the time, I didn't take the threat seriously, but I should have. Later that night, Nico clocked out without further incident. Oscar and I continued restocking items from a late delivery truck. At some point, Oscar went to refill the beverage coolers while I stayed in the front to stock shelves. The doorbell chimed, signaling that someone had entered the store. "Good evening," I called out, heading toward the register. When I reached the front, I froze. It was Nico. He wasn't wearing his uniform, and his face was twisted into an unsettling grin. My stomach dropped when I saw he was holding a knife. He walked toward the counter and stopped, staring at me. In a sing-song tone, he said, "I'm going to cut you into tiny little pieces, so small they'll never find you." Fear surged through me as I realized the danger I was in. I screamed for Oscar, who came running from the back. Seeing Nico with the knife, Oscar didn't hesitate. He lunged at Nico, knocking him off balance. "Run," Oscar yelled. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted toward the back door, my heart pounding. When I reached it, I discovered Nico had blocked it with a dumpster. We were trapped. I turned to see Nico recovering, his knife glinting under the fluorescent lights. Oscar grabbed a shelf pole and stood between us and Nico, shouting for him to leave. Just then, we heard sirens in the distance. Nico hesitated for a moment, then fled out the front door. The police arrived shortly after and arrested him a few blocks away. That night was the most terrifying experience of my life. Nico was charged with attempted murder and other crimes. I never saw him again, but the memory of that night still haunts me. What started as a quiet movie night with my mom turned into a terrifying ordeal when a stranger tracked me down online. How did he find me and what did he want? Watch to the end to uncover this chilling encounter. When I was still a senior in high school, my mother and I had a tradition of going to the movies almost every weekend. It was our regular bonding ritual. We would watch a movie, review it, and then head to the Burger King next door for dinner. We always picked up something from my dad to a takeout box for him to enjoy later. One Friday, like any other, we followed our routine. We went to the movies, had our meal, and drove home. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. The next morning, I woke up to a Facebook friend request from someone I didn't recognize. Thinking it might be a suggestion from a mutual friend, I accepted it without much thought. 5 minutes later, I received a message from the same account. It read, "Hey, I know this might sound a little weird, but I saw you at Burger King last night and was wondering if you'd like to go out sometime." I froze. Someone had seen me at Burger King and tracked me down online. How had he found me? Had he overheard my mom say my name? The thought alone sent chills down my spine. The message itself was polite, but the fact that he had gone to such lengths to find me was unnerving. I immediately saw red flags. I had no intention of accepting his invitation, but I didn't want to be rude either. I replied, "Hi, yes, I was there, but I'm actually seeing someone right now, and I don't think I'm interested in dating anyone else." At first, his response seemed respectful. That's too bad. I'm sorry if this is awkward." I replied, "No worries. You didn't know. I hope you have a great weekend." I crafted my reply to end the conversation politely, but firmly. However, when I closed the chat, there was a subtle shift in his tone. It wasn't outright aggressive, but it carried an unsettling edge. I just thought, since I went to all this effort to find you, you could at least give me a chance to get to know me. That single sentence made my stomach churn. How had he found me? I asked him directly. "How did you find me?" He started typing, then stopped. He typed again, only to stop once more. Finally, his response came. Where there's a will, there are ways. I can find anyone online. It's easy. When I set my mind to something, I achieve it. Tell me, is your current boyfriend an achiever like that? His words gave me goosebumps. The way he phrased it made him sound unhinged. I wanted to know exactly how this creep had tracked me down, so I decided to fish for answers. I wrote. Honestly, I didn't know it was that easy. It's kind of cool that you're so resourceful. How did you do it? He responded quickly, as if proud of himself. I was the one who swiped your mom's card. It wasn't hard to match the name to a profile on Facebook. I froze. He wasn't some tech genius or hacker. He was just an employee at Burger King. He had overheard my name, matched it to my mom's card, and searched for me online. I had to stifle a nervous laugh at how ridiculous and horrifying his behavior was. I didn't want to anger him, so I replied calmly. Ah, clever. I like that. But like I said, I'm seeing someone, so thanks, but no thanks, bye. I muted the conversation but didn't block him or remove him from my friend list, thinking it might make him angrier. I felt uneasy, but I tried to go about my day. That evening, after running errands and finishing my homework, I went to bed, unaware that this lunatic was still fixated on me. Later that night, I opened Messenger on my phone to see 67 notifications. They were all from him. I felt a wave of panic as I realized he had been sending me messages throughout the day. I opened the chat to read them, and my fear escalated with each one. His earlier politeness had turned into nice guy-style humiliation, mixed with outright threats of violence. He wrote that if he could find me on Facebook in just a few hours, imagine what he could learn by the end of the week. One message said he had friends who could help him break into my house. He described in graphic detail how they would tie up my parents, kill them in front of me, and then take turns abusing me until I died. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The final message before I ran downstairs to tell my parents read, "I'm in my car and on my way to your house." Tears streamed down my face as I explained everything to my mom and dad. My dad immediately called the police. The guy was arrested that night. He admitted to sending the messages and was sentenced to several months in jail. He also lost his job at Burger King, thanks to my mom making sure his boss knew what he had done. I was granted a restraining order, and I never heard from him again. I know I was lucky. Many women aren't as fortunate when they encounter someone this disturbed. Their stalkers go beyond threats and cause real harm. This experience taught me to be more cautious online and to protect my personal information. It also made me realize how dangerous people can be when they feel entitled to someone's attention. I hope that one day we can live in a world where men don't act predatory and creepy toward women they like. It's counterintuitive to what women want in a man, and I wish they could understand that. Until then, all we can do is stay vigilant, be safer online, and protect ourselves.